The identity of Jack the Ripper is a mystery for the ages. Many theories have been proposed as to who this serial killer was. Some of the men that have made it to this list include Prince Albert Victor, Aaron Kosminski, Walter Sickert, and Lewis Carroll. There was even some talk about Jack being a Jill, a convicted murderer named Mary Piercy. But what if the real Jack the Ripper was actually a man that had been already interviewed by police, only for them to release him and allow him to leave the country, never to be found again? And all these theories of who the Ripper might be are just a cover-up to hide the fact that the police had made such a grievous mistake. We came across this theory on TikTok from an account that has already been deleted, so we have no way of tracing the author and finding out what he knows. While the theory is a bit on the wild side, it intrigued us enough to go digging. Join us in our search for this mysterious suspect and any clues that prove this theory's validity. So, how does the theory go? According to the TikTok user, the identity of Jack the Ripper has always been known by the police. He was detained and questioned, but then they released him. The suspect then left the country before they could arrest him again. Scotland Yard then covered up their failure, which led to the birth of so many theories on the identity of the Ripper all these years. According to the user, his theory is supported by the fact that the case files on the Ripper case have still not been made public. All Freedom of Information applications for the files have been declined, with the reason that the information may have an impact on living persons. Take note that this might have been true when the user made his theory. However, some of the police files were made public recently. Now, it can't be denied that the theory is pretty vague and the evidence used to support it is a bit flimsy as well. But seeing as we live in the age where there's always information to be found, there must be a trace or lead that we can follow. Based on this theory, the real Jack the Ripper was one of the men that the police had questioned, detained, and then released. Looking at the list of suspects at the time, we can cross out several of them, such as Lewis Carroll, Prince Albert Victor, H.H. Holmes, and Mary Piercy. Now, there were several men that were questioned by the police, so we'll need to narrow the list even more using information that we know to be true. So, what do we actually know about the Ripper? Based on the crimes and all surviving archives made available to the public, he should be someone who knew the area well. Though the murders were committed in the early hours of the morning, he would have needed a place to go where he could clean up. Otherwise, he would have been noticed since he was covered in blood. More importantly, on the night of the double murders, the bodies of the women Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were located across town, but they were discovered within 45 minutes of each other. So the Ripper had to have been able to move about quickly in the area to be able to murder them and avoid discovery. We can also conclude that the Ripper was most likely a local, someone who could blend in with the people in the community. He was definitely not a well-dressed stranger slumming it in a poverty-stricken area. He would have stood out based on his clothes and bearing alone. Even if the Ripper wore a disguise to blend in, he would still be noticed because most of the people were very familiar with each other. The Ripper would also be someone daring, willing to take a lot of risks. Except for Mary Kelly, all of the victims were killed out in the open. Not only that, when Catherine Eddowes was murdered, a patrolman was just 15 minutes away from the scene, walking his route around Mitre Square. Aside from these characteristics, another thing we can deduce from the murders is that the Ripper has some anatomical knowledge. How could he have extracted body parts from some of the victims without prior knowledge? Take note that this does not indicate that the killer is someone from the medical profession. A butcher, for example, would have some insight to human anatomy. The most important factor that we can use to narrow down our list of suspects is his alibi. He should have been in Whitechapel at the time of each murder. Having an alibi for even just one of the canonical 5 murders means we have the wrong person. Based on all of these requirements, we found one person who seemed to fit the bill: Francis Tumblety. Francis Tumblety was an American quack doctor and fake Indian herbalist. His name was provided by one of the police officers as someone worth checking out. He was arrested on suspicion of the murders, but there wasn't sufficient evidence to hold him, so the police decided to charge him with gross indecency and indecent assault. It seemed that Tumblety had engaged in sexual relationships with young men. This was still illegal in England at the time. The police used correspondence they found on Tumblety to charge him with this misdemeanor offence. They formally arrested him on November 7, 1888. However, Tumblety was released on bail. 1 or 2 days later, Mary Kelly was brutally murdered. She was the last victim of the Ripper. After posting bail, Tumblety was able to slip away. He instructed his lawyer to ask for a postponement on his hearing, which was granted. Then he snuck out of England on November 23rd, making his way to Bologna, France. From there, he took a transatlantic steamship to New York. Because his charge was just a misdemeanor offence, Tumblety wouldn't be extradited back to England. 6 months later, in July 1889, another prostitute was murdered. At the time, the police believed that the Ripper had become active again. As a result, they crossed Tumblety off their list because he was already in New York. It was only later that they realized that the Ripper wasn't responsible for this crime. In fact, most experts agree that the Ripper only committed 5 murders, the canonical 5. So we know that Tumblety was a suspect. He was detained, released on bail, and was able to sneak out of the country, checking all of the boxes specified by the TikTok user. What about our checklist for Jack the Ripper? There's no question that Tumblety was a daring individual. He was a quack doctor, but he wasn't afraid of advertising his skills to the public in a grand way. Though he was often described as peculiar, he still had a lot of people who believed in his skills. Obviously, he wasn't afraid of being caught at all. Aside from his daring personality, we believe that Tumblety had no alibi for the 5 murders. He arrived in London around May 1888, just a few months before the murders began. Though he was not a local, he was known to frequently visit the slums of every city he went to, seeking encounters with young men. Yes, he was eccentric and flamboyant, often going around as a well-dressed, even flashy gentleman. But we need to remember that homosexuality was still illegal in England at the time. It's only logical to assume that he wouldn't be parading in his best clothes in the streets of Whitechapel. He would be low-key, trying to blend in with the people of the community. As for anatomical knowledge, we can assume that he had a fair amount of understanding. For one, it was reported that he had a fascination with human body parts. There are rumors that he was a collector and particularly enjoyed collecting women's uteri. Supposedly, he had revealed this collection to some medical professionals at a lecture in New York City. Of course, there's no proof that he did have human parts in his possession. But his profession as a quack doctor who successfully treated patients could lead us to believe that he understood human anatomy to some extent. That's not all the evidence that points to Tumblety as the Ripper. In a letter sent by the head of the Metropolitan Police's Special Irish Branch, Chief Inspector John Littlechild, to George Sims, a journalist, he specifically mentioned the most likely suspect in the Ripper murders, a Dr. T, who was an American quack named Tumblety. Littlechild thought that Tumblety had committed suicide after he disappeared. But what he didn't know was that from the moment Tumblety arrived in New York, the NYPD had been keeping him under surveillance. Though it must be noted that Inspector Burns of the NYPD told the media that Tumblety was not the Whitechapel murderer. Then again, why would you put a person under surveillance if he was just guilty of a misdemeanor offence? He couldn't be deported anyway. More importantly, 2 Scotland Yard officials reached out to at least 2 US chiefs of police, San Francisco's Patrick Crowley and Brooklyn's Patrick Campbell, for information on Tumblety. The request was sent on November 22nd. At the time, Scotland Yard had no idea that Tumblety was no longer in the country. Crowley reportedly sent samples of Tumblety's handwriting to Scotland Yard. There were even reports made by journalists on December 4th, 1888, that an English detective was stalking out Tumblety's home. Supposedly, the detective told a bartender that he was there to investigate the Whitechapel murderer. Whether this is true or just something the media made up, we'll never know. On December 11th of that year, first-class CID Walter Andrews, one of the officers involved in the Whitechapel investigation, told a reporter that he knew of Tumblety, but denied that he was Jack the Ripper. However, he also mentioned that he was interested in interviewing him. Why would you want to interview a person who jumped bail for gross indecency? But why would Tumblety murder women when he was more interested in men? Well, if the Ripper murders were considered sex crimes, then we can conclude that Tumblety was not Jack the Ripper. Most gay male sadosexual serial killers target men. However, it is believed that Jack the Ripper had a hatred of women. According to forensic pathologist Dr. William Eckert, MD, who investigated the Whitechapel murders, the motive could be anger retaliation. Forensic scientist and criminal profiler Dr. Brent Turvey also believed that the killings were not sexual in nature. The motive was misogyny. Interestingly enough, it was reported that Tumblety had admitted hating women, believing them to be a curse to the land. They were, according to him, the cause of the world's trouble, and they lured away young males from their intended lovers, older men like him. Of course, none of this can be proven. The fact that Tumblety was never arrested in New York is often used to debunk this theory. However, if the police did have evidence, they wouldn't have let him go in the first place and used a minor offense to try to keep him in a cell. They had suspicions, but no evidence. Even now, what we've found is merely circumstantial. A lot of it is based on assumptions gathered from information known about Jack the Ripper and what we can glean from reports made a century ago. But it does make you think. Did the police make a mistake all those years ago? Was the real Jack the Ripper already in their hands, and then they let him go? Maybe. We may never truly know. If you love our content and want to support the channel, feel free to check our web shop where you can find exclusive true crime merch brought to you by Bad Things.